Welcome to 60 Minutes on We. I'm Lara Logan. It's estimated that somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 men and women in U.S. prisons suffer from serious mental disorders. But what kind of care can they get behind bars? In this edition, you'll see that it runs the gamut from a troubled young man who dies when prison authorities physically restrain him to our first story about a schizophrenic inmate who, due to the care he's getting in prison, might someday be deemed sane enough to execute. Greg Thompson sits on death row in Tennessee. The Supreme Court has ruled it's unconstitutional to execute an insane prisoner, deeming it cruel and unusual punishment. But can medication make a prisoner sane enough to be executed? Years ago, Thompson was found competent to stand trial for murder. But prison doctors have since determined that he's schizophrenic, and they treat him daily with antipsychotic drugs. His lawyers argue that he's still insane on the medication, which he was taking the day I met him in 2007.
I had to stab the food to eat.
You had to stab your food?
Yeah, especially eggs. It'd be popping up. It'd be popping up at you, hitting you in the face, so you have to stab it. And then you gotta eat it. Quick, real quick.
We met Greg Thompson inside a maximum security prison in Nashville.
Which way?
He's been diagnosed as schizophrenic and psychotic by both prison doctors and those hired by his lawyers. And he's been medicated by the state for most of his more than 20 years on death row. Thompson receives a daily cocktail of antipsychotic, mood-stabilizing pills and injections twice a month. Do you know why you're getting this medication?
Yeah, I'm nuts.
How many pills do you have to take?
I only take 10 a day now.
What happens if you don't take them?
I go Lulu.
Tell me what going Lulu is for you.
In a few days, I would lose my mind, and it would be trying to explode on me. I got in a fight with the guards a lot of times, tried to kill a few.
Did you kill any of them?
No, but at the time they was turning into insects, and I wanted to kill
The guards were turning into insects?
them. Yeah. They were giant insects. They was acting just like the guards, but they were alien. And I had to kill the aliens. They were attacking the world.
A psychologist who has evaluated Thompson for more than 9 years says he sees, hears and smells things that aren't there and suffers from extreme paranoid delusions and hallucinations. But when he was on trial for murder over 20 years ago, his lawyers didn't raise insanity as a defense. He confessed, was convicted, and sentenced to death for killing this woman, Brenda Lane. She was 28 years old, well-liked in her community, and she'd been married just a few months. The facts of what happened on New Year's Day in 1985 have never been in dispute. Greg Thompson and his girlfriend, a juvenile, wanted to get from Tennessee to Georgia, so they kidnapped Brenda Lane, stole her car, and then drove around for an hour and a half on remote country roads as Thompson searched for a place to kill her. And this is where they stopped. Thompson then stabbed Brenda 4 times in the back and drove off, leaving her to die alone in the cold and the dark.
I thought I had to kill to survive.
Thompson told us he heard voices in his head that night. You thought people were after you?
Yes.
And then, in chilling detail, he described exactly how he killed Brenda Lane.
She got into the front seat, driver's seat, and I had the knife on her, and I sat in the back seat. And
You jumped in the car and pulled a knife on her?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The knife was already out. It was a butcher knife.
She must have been scared.
Yeah, she's crying.
She was terrified for her life.
I know.
What did you feel?
She knows she's going to die.
Why'd you kill her?
There was no reasoning at that point. It was just get away.
Tell me how it happened. Describe
I
it for
turned
me.
her around and she didn't move. And I stabbed her 4 times. I wanted her to die quickly.
You wanted her to die quickly?
Not in pain. I didn't want her to be in that suffering and pain.
You think if somebody stabs you 4 times in the back, you're not going to suffer?
Not really, no.
You know she was still alive when you drove away.
I heard her scream.
Thompson managed to escape to Georgia, but was arrested there after setting Brenda Lane's car on fire. Frankie Floyd, an investigator in the case back in Tennessee, says it could have taken months to find the body if Thompson, over the telephone, hadn't given such precise, intricate directions to the place he killed her. What was going through your mind at the time when you were talking to him on the phone?
How calm he was. There was no remorse. There was no passion. It was just matter of fact. If you take this road, this road, this road, and this road.
So exact.
It's like you telling me how to find a Frisbee that you've tossed and lost.
So what did that mean to you?
Cold, impassioned. Just a cruel person.
That was the picture prosecutors painted of Thompson at his trial, but it wasn't a complete picture, according to Thompson's current lawyers, Dana Chavis and Steve Kissinger, who are appealing his case. They say Thompson had severe mental problems dating back to his childhood, and they're fighting to keep him alive. If he knew what he was doing at the time, and he was competent to be executed at the time that sentence was given, why shouldn't he die for what he did?
I think the evidence points overwhelmingly to the fact that he was insane at the time.
But it was never proved, and it wasn't raised at the trial. He told them exactly what he'd done to stabbed her 4 times in the back. He even told them where he'd thrown out the murder weapon, so they could find that on the side of the road.
I think the fact that Greg Thompson can remember things does not detract from the fact that at the time of the crime, he was suffering delusions, and he was hearing voices.
Never brought up at the trial.
That's correct. Never brought up at the trial because the trial attorneys did not consult with the proper people that would have seen those clear signs of Greg's psychosis at the time. The clear signs of psychosis that everybody agrees about right now.
A federal appeals court ruled that a lower court should examine evidence that Thompson was mentally ill at the time of the crime. One judge called it powerful mitigating evidence. But then the Supreme Court narrowly overruled the decision, saying it was too late to raise that issue. Barbara Brown, Brenda Lane's only sister, who sat through every day of Thompson's trial, is frustrated by the lengthy legal process.
I don't believe that he was insane at the time he killed her. Now, I don't know. He's been sitting on death row. Almost anyone might be insane after this period of time. It's just not right that he was given a death sentence and it not carried out.
Brenda Lane is buried on a hillside about a mile from her sister Barbara's house. Every Sunday, Barbara goes back to the same church where she and her sister played piano, sang, and prayed together. Barbara thinks the legal system is protecting Greg Thompson and has forgotten her sister.
It destroyed my family, basically. My mother certainly never got over it. And my dad absolutely wanted to see him executed.
Both parents and Brenda's husband have all died since she was killed.
Even my husband has now passed away.
Our hearts go out to the sister. And of course, what happened is a terrible tragedy. But the point now is that Greg Thompson is psychotic, that he's delusional, that he does not have a rational understanding of why the state seeks to execute him.
In what could be a last chance appeal, Thompson's lawyers only have to prove he's insane now and doesn't understand what's happening to him, even when he's on medication, as he was during our interview. He appeared most of the time to be delusional.
Well, see, I wrote some songs and sent them to Hollywood.
Who'd you write them for?
Garth Brooks, Reba McEntire.
You like country?
Yeah, I was born country.
What was the first song you wrote?
Let's see. Dirty dishes in the sink. Dirty dishes in the sink. Mm-hmm. Lots of time for me to think.
They send you money for these songs?
Yeah. I've gotten paid twice, which I'm waiting on this time. The last check they sent me was $444,000.
$444,000. What did you do with that money?
I sent it to Brenda Lane's family.
You sure about that?
Yeah.
What if I said to you there was no check?
It's in my name.
What if I said to you, though, there was no check? It's in your head, not in your name.
No, that was a check. It was in my head, you know.
Are you a con man? Are you acting for me?
No. I'm serious. This is me. This is who I am.
And how can you be sure that Greg Thompson is not just acting up, that he's not just pretending?
For over 20 years, prison doctors have administered very powerful antipsychotic drugs to Greg Thompson. I don't know of any doctor that would prescribe or force that type of medication upon a person unless they believed they were truly psychotic.
And what is the effect of that medication?
It doesn't take away his mental illness. He's always insane. But what it does is that it hides that insanity.
But it doesn't actually make him normal.
Not at all.
But does Thompson understand that taking the medication may make him appear sane enough to be executed?
Well, I made a choice years ago that if I were to get to that point, I'd rather be normal than insane.
Why is that?
Because it hurts. I'm tired of being mentally ill, you know. So if they wanted to kill me at the end, then they kill me at the end.
I think I have to forgive him. I am a Christian, and we are to forgive people. It's hard.
But you want him to die for what he did?
Yes, I do want to see him executed.
Thompson's lawyers are going back to federal court and hope eventually to get a ruling that Thompson, despite his medication, is mentally incompetent and should not be executed. The Tennessee Attorney General, who declined our request for an interview, is expected to argue that Thompson understands why he's being punished, is not insane, and therefore should be executed. Are you afraid to die?
I'm on drugs right now, and I feel good. I'm not afraid. When these drugs wear off a little bit, I'll be afraid again.
If you were executed, what do you think would happen to you afterwards? What comes next?
Well, I know this dead can speak.
Who can speak?
The dead.
The dead can speak. You think you would die?
I think it'll be a horrible ending. Because if the dead can speak, that means you got thought in the grave. You got thoughts going on in the grave. I don't know about that.
Greg Thompson's appeal was argued in October of 2008, and by early 2009, there was still no verdict from the court on whether Thompson's medications make him sane enough to be executed. Increasingly, America's mentally ill are ending up in prisons rather than hospitals, and that's bad for the mentally ill and overwhelming to prison officials, which might explain what happened to one mentally ill man who was sent to jail for shoplifting and ended up dead. Timothy Souders was chained to a concrete slab by prison guards until he died a terrible death from thirst. If it wasn't for a medical investigator working for a federal judge, no one might ever have known the truth about Souders' death. The investigator discovered his torturous end on prison videotapes. A warning: they are hard to watch and tough to take. They open a horrifying window on mental illness behind bars. Scott Pelley has the story.
This is a prison in America, and that's Tim Souders, dying of dehydration. He was in solitary at the Southern Michigan Correctional Center. He was 21, serving 3 to 5 years. Though an investigation would show that he needed urgent psychiatric care, Souders was chained down, hands, feet, and waist, up to 17 hours at a time. By prison rules, all of this was recorded on a 24-hour surveillance camera and by the guards themselves. The tape records a rapid descent. He started apparently healthy, but in 4 days, Souders could barely walk. In the shower, he fell over. The guards brought him back in a wheelchair, but then chained him down again. On August 6th, he was released from restraints and fell for the last time. Tim Souders died right there. Only the surveillance camera took notice. His short life began in Adrian, Michigan. Souders was a kid whose troubles didn't start until late in his teenage years.
Hi, Grandma. Happy Easter.
It was then his mother, Teresa Vaughn, told us that he began acting strangely.
It was January in the wintertime, and he was running around outside with his clothes off thinking he was a knight fighting dragons. You lose touch with reality.
He was troubled by anxiety and depression, often in and out of the hospital. After one hospital stay, he was caught shoplifting 2 paintball guns. He grabbed a pocket knife and threatened the store employees, then begged a cop to shoot him. Instead, he was stunned with a taser. No one was hurt.
He had gotten to the point where his thinking wasn't straight and he was suicidal. And he should have never went to jail.
In jail, Souders tried to kill himself 3 times. He pled to resisting arrest and assault for waving the pocket knife and ended up in a Jackson County prison complex with 5,000 inmates. It's a troubled place. Prisoners filed suit here in the 1980s, and since then, their welfare has been monitored by a federal judge. When Souders arrived, he was part of a national trend. There are 300,000 mental patients behind bars nationwide. That's because starting in the 1960s, mental hospitals have been closing, and as patients ended up in jail, prisons became the new asylums.
They became de facto mental hospitals, and the prisons were ill-equipped to handle it.
To understand Souders' case, we went to an insider. Robert Walsh is a clinical psychologist, 25 years in Michigan prisons. He was a deputy warden and director of psychological services in the prison where Souders died. He retired 6 years before Souders arrived.
Given what you see in the Souders videotape, what should have been happening?
What should have been happening was, right away, mental health staff should have been consulted and reported to the scene, and they should have intervened, given that he wasn't assaultive against anybody.
But there was no mental health staff to consult. The psychiatrist was on a 7-week leave.
Then he should have been replaced. It's too critical a situation.
This situation started when Souders took a shower without permission. That landed him in solitary. When he broke a stool and used his sink to flood his cell, that's when the chains came out.
Is that too tight?
What the prison calls top-of-bed restraints. Psychologist Robert Walsh did an extensive study of Michigan prisons, and he found in a number of cases the staff insists inmates are not mentally ill, despite profound insanity.
One man enucleated his eyes, cut them out, because he felt they were offending God. These were men that were claimed to be manipulative, malingerers, and non-mentally ill.
Wait a minute. Did I just understand you to say that the Department of Corrections declared those men not mentally ill?
The staff did. That's correct. The psychiatric and psychological staff considered them to be malingerers and manipulators that went to extremes.
After his arrest, a state psychologist said Souders was trying to manipulate the staff when he stabbed himself 7 times in the stomach in a suicide attempt. Months later, in solitary, there was no psychiatric intervention even when Souders was raving.
Orange, blue, red, yellow, green. I'm ready to go home.
A social worker wanted him transferred to a hospital, but the paperwork never got done. The guards resorted again to chains that the federal judge overseeing the prison criticized as punitive restraints. Patricia Caruso is the director of Michigan's prison system.
What are punitive restraints?
We do not actually use punitive restraints. We use restraints. Punitive implies restraints are for punishment. Restraints are never used for punishment. Restraints are used for protection. They are used for the protection of the prisoner from harming themselves or for the protection of others from being harmed by the prisoner.
But Tim Souders wasn't harming anyone, and this prison report shows that it was his attempt to break the stool and flood his cell that led to the authorization to put him in top-of-bed restraints.
You're going to be in a restraint. It depends on you how long you're in these, okay? You can't flood yourself. You can't do that type of stuff, right? We put you in restraints to kind of control your behavior.
We've seen cases where people have been in restraints on and off, day after day after day. And I have not found a mental health expert who has told me that that's a good idea.
It is on and off. People are removed from restraints. Even prior to that, people were removed from restraints at a maximum of every 2 hours and would get up and walk around.
2 hours? We checked the surveillance tape. Souders was up some of the time, but we found he was restrained for stretches of 12 hours, 16 hours, and 17 hours. Tim Souders had bed sores. On the third day in restraints, Souders resisted for the first and only time, complaining bitterly about the hours in chains.
I'm tired of this. 18 hours is not justified.
Recently, Michigan's corrections director, Patricia Caruso, suggested limiting the total time in restraints to 6 hours.
Federal judges described that as trading 6 hours of evil for unlimited evil. Evil is evil, he's saying. You're smiling.
No, I
Surely
don't.
you take that seriously.
I absolutely take that seriously. Prison is a difficult environment. I have correctional officers who become accustomed to having urine and feces thrown on them by prisoners, who have prisoners who are so injurious that they will open their body to remove organs from it. And so we have to rely on our responsibility to keep people safe.
But Michigan prisons have not been safe for mentally ill prisoners who have died needlessly. At least one starved to death, and others died of dehydration, like Souders. Jeffrey Clark, a paranoid schizophrenic serving time for robbery, died of thirst in solitary. His sister, Benita Clark Murphy, pored over the investigative reports of his death.
There are reports that he had his mouth up against the plexiglass window, begging and pleading for water and air, and for someone, again, to turn a deaf ear and a blind eye to that. That's why I say Jeffrey was tortured.
Clark Murphy filed suit against the state. She claims that the warden told the family that her brother died of an infection.
We buried Jeff not even knowing what happened.
It seems that the prison officials expected to tell you that this was natural causes and that you'd just leave it alone.
Absolutely. And that they were so wrong.
Clark was locked in solitary in the heat of the summer with his water turned off. And 4 years later, the heat index in solitary was over 100 when Souders' water was turned off. Souders became delusional, refused water when offered, but not even that was a medical emergency to the staff.
Souders has refused. The officer asked him if he needed water. He replied, no.
After Souders' death, federal judge Richard Insland, who oversees the prison, wrote that inmates are exposed to an unauthorized death penalty at the hands of a callous and dysfunctional healthcare system that regularly fails to treat life-threatening illness.
I understand that it's easy to take individual cases and to sensationalize them and, relentlessly replay the facts of an individual case. But I also think it's unfair.
But, Director, fair to say, people starve to death and die of thirst in your prisons.
Any death, any incident like that, in our custody is a tragedy. I will not deny that. It is not. It certainly isn't something that we set out. I mean, we have people come to us dying.
They don't come to you dying of thirst and dying of starvation. How can that happen under your custody?
I'm not going to address cases that are under litigation. I cannot do that.
The Souders case is under litigation. His mother, Teresa Vaughn, is suing. She says the prison never told her how her son died. She found out in the Detroit Free Press.
I hesitate to bring this up, but you have seen the videotapes of your son's last days. When you see those videotapes,
The ones I have nightmares about?
what do you think?
I cannot believe anyone would treat another human being that way at all. That they can watch over a 4-day period, slowly declining, slowly dying before their eyes.
Do you think the guards meant to kill your son?
I don't believe anybody meant to kill Tim. I don't believe that they meant to hurt Tim, but they did. They did hurt him, and he did die. He's not coming home. He's not coming back, and he is gone. And he was only 21 years old.
In July of 2008, Timothy Souter's mother settled a lawsuit with the state of Michigan for $3.25 million in the wrongful death of her son. She says she will donate some of that money to inmate advocacy organizations. Jeffrey Clark's family won a nearly $3 million verdict against Michigan prison employees from a federal jury. The state is still appealing the judge's ban on those restraints used on Souders. In 1986, the Supreme Court said that it would shock the conscience of the nation to execute prisoners who are severely mentally ill, and it ruled that inmates cannot be put to death if they're incompetent, so mentally ill that they don't understand the crime they committed and the punishment they face. But once a prisoner is deemed to be that insane, how far can a state go to improve his condition? Can the state, for instance, require a doctor to restore an inmate's sanity simply so that he may be put to death? In 2001, Leslie Stoll reported on a controversial death penalty case in Arizona, a case that put one physician in an untenable position, caught between the state's orders and his professional code of ethics.
The case involves Claude Macerana, who was sentenced to death for the brutal murder of a 16-year-old boy. While Macerana awaited execution, the court appointed Tucson attorney Carla Ryan to handle his appeal, a job, she says, that proved to be nearly impossible.
You'll be talking to him, and he'll start talking about the IRS and Interpol, and he'll go into numbers. He'll be talking to you, and then say 714, 819, 42, and he goes on like that in a whole conversation.
Concerned about his sanity, Ryan asked the court to order a psychiatric evaluation of her client.
2 doctors were appointed. The state selected one of the doctors from a list, and I selected one. And they both came back very strongly saying my client was not competent.
So what did the court do?
They found him incompetent to be executed, and they sent my client to the state hospital.
There, Macerana was held in solitary confinement in the specially built maximum security cell and put under the care of the hospital's chief psychiatrist, Dr. Jerry Dennis, who diagnosed him as having paranoid schizophrenia.
He would believe things that he was involved in world investigations via an electronic device that had been implanted into his brain. Most of the time it involves what he calls world police, the INI, the BUSU, the Boku-O.
Dr. Dennis agreed that Macerana was incompetent, which meant he could not be executed unless, that is, he got better. And under Arizona law, the job of making him better fell to Dr. Dennis. If you gave him aggressive treatment, would he come up to a level that the state would accept as sufficient to put him to death?
That's a very good question. I believe that the probability is there that he would make substantial improvement.
Now, the Hippocratic Oath that you swear to when you became a doctor says you shall do no harm.
Mm-hmm.
They're asking you to prepare someone to be put to death, which is the ultimate harm.
Yeah, so what do I do?
What he did was to refuse to comply with the law that said he was supposed to treat Macerana.
So I'm in a total no-win situation. I'm in violation of the law every day.
His quandary went beyond the law. If he had medicated Macerana, he'd have violated the American Medical Association's Code of Medical Ethics, which specifically says physicians should not treat a prisoner to restore competence so he can be executed. What would happen to you in the eyes of your profession if you did treat Macerana?
I could lose my professional standing as a board-certified psychiatrist.
You could be sanctioned?
I could be sanctioned, lose my license.
Dr. Dennis put Macerana on a low dose of antipsychotic medication, enough to alleviate any suffering, but not enough to affect his paranoid schizophrenia. That infuriated the Arizona Attorney General's office, that felt Dr. Dennis's first duty was to obey the law, not the AMA.
We're simply asking him to treat, to make this person well. That's all the state law requires him to do.
Paul McMurdy is the former state's Assistant Attorney General who handled the Macerana case. A doctor takes an oath to do no harm. What's he supposed to do?
Well, we're not asking him to perform the execution.
But do you not see that he would feel he has a hand in it? Even if he doesn't pull the lever or push the button, you don't even see that he's facilitating and therefore is doing harm?
I believe that he simply should make the person well.
Some legal scholars say that the Arizona law is an end run around the Supreme Court's ruling that the incompetent are not to be executed. But the Arizona Attorney General's office continued to pursue the Maturana execution by threatening Dr. Dennis with contempt of court and possible jail time. And yet he still refused to treat Maturana. Here you are, it's either jail or you can't practice medicine anymore.
Right, absolutely.
As a compromise, he was told that if he wouldn't do it, he had to find somebody else to carry out the treatment.
If I was not going to be willing to do it, then it was still our responsibility to find somebody who would.
But Dr. Dennis felt he couldn't ask another physician to do something he refused to do. So the job fell to his boss, Jack Silver, the hospital's CEO, who was not a doctor, and therefore...
I didn't have a problem at all with looking for another physician to provide this care.
But the 16 psychiatrists on his staff and all those at the prison had the same ethical problem as Dr. Dennis. So then the Attorney General's office told him to take out a newspaper ad. You advertised for a psychiatrist to come here and medicate Claude Maturana for this execution.
We indicated in the ad that we were looking that there was a prisoner in the Department of Corrections who was incompetent to be executed, and we were looking for a psychiatrist who would treat that individual.
An ad in the paper?
Ad in the paper.
Interested parties were told to write or call the Arizona Department of Health Services, but there were no takers. Did you keep going?
We expanded the process, if you will, on a statewide basis, so we wrote letters to every licensed psychiatrist in the state of Arizona.
You're kidding.
And to
How many letters?
Over 1,400 letters. Now, those also included licensed nurse practitioners, because in Arizona, a nurse practitioner can also prescribe medication.
So you advertised, you sent out 1,400 letters.
1,400 individual letters.
Statewide, and still nobody would do it.
Still no takers, right.
That was hardly the end of it. The Attorney General persevered, pressing him to keep looking. That's when he reached out to the 37 other states with the death penalty. Why is the state so determined to execute this particular man? You know, if he's incompetent, he's incompetent. Why pursue it with this intensity?
In this instance, the state isn't convinced Maturana is incompetent.
He says that some of the prison guards testified that Maturana wasn't as ill as the doctors thought he was.
We started to get information that maybe Maturana was faking it.
You got information he was faking it?
Right.
Now, I would think if you're facing death, this might be something you'd think up.
My client actually denies having the hallucinations and delusions. He thinks he's normal. If you're going to fake it, you're not going to lie about having the negative aspects.
And she says he can seem normal.
Almost everything he tells me is not true, but it sounds very normal sometimes. Like he'll tell me about his mother having a breast cancer operation a month ago. She died when he was 14. He tells me about his children, and he'll talk at length about his children. He has no children. So you can have a conversation, but if you go back and check the facts, they're just not there.
The question of whether Claude Maturana was faking it ended up in court, where a judge rejected the whole idea, since none of the guards had college degrees, let alone any expertise in psychology. So the Attorney General kept pushing for another doctor to treat Maturana. Jack Silver finally found someone, Dr. Nelson Bennett, a psychiatrist in Georgia who works for a for-profit company that provides mental health services to prisons around the country. Dr. Bennett said he was bound by the same code of ethics as the other doctors, but for $2,300, he agreed to see if Maturana was suffering in any way. Dr. Bennett wouldn't talk to us, so we asked the hospital CEO, Jack Silver, if you found out he were suffering, then what?
Well, the code of ethics is clear that that's the one condition under which you can treat somebody who's in that situation, because it is a physician's duty to relieve suffering. Why didn't you rely on Dr. Dennis for that? Well, Jerry was clear that he didn't believe he was suffering.
Well, why have someone come and second guess your own doctor's opinion?
I guess it could be viewed as second guessing.
Well, what was it?
It was more that same process of searching the country, searching the state, to see if we could find a practitioner that would be willing to evaluate this individual and render a judgment about whether or not they felt they could treat him.
So what was Bennett's conclusion? Is he suffering?
Well, he didn't get that far. He determined that he was competent. He felt that the standard of the law...
Did you ask him to say whether he was competent?
That sort of surprised us, that was his conclusion. It hadn't occurred to us to ask to raise that question.
So you thought he was coming in to tell you whether he was suffering, which he never did.
Right.
And he told you he was competent, which you never asked him to determine.
Right.
He spent a few minutes with my client on November 4th, saw him again the next day doing what I basically call a drive-by psychological exam, and lo and behold, my client's competent by this one doctor.
Carla Ryan was shocked. The opinion of the out-of-state doctor was nullifying the diagnoses of 4 other psychiatrists, and there was apparently no avenue of appeal. Ryan accused the Attorney General's office of sandbagging her.
Never did anyone tell me they were bringing in a doctor and they'd been shopping for a doctor for months to find somebody to come in and find my client competent.
They were shopping for a doctor?
They were absolutely shopping. I couldn't do that. No court would have ever let me do that. If my client had been found competent, they would never have let me go and just find another doctor.
She went to court to try and get the Bennett diagnosis thrown out.
When I asked to have Dr. Bennett report challenged, let me talk to Dr. Bennett, the state came in and said I had no right to do that because the statute was absolute. It was a done deal.
The Arizona Supreme Court agreed with the state that under the law, once an inmate is deemed competent by any psychiatrist, the state of Arizona has all it needs to execute him. So Dr. Bennett's diagnosis was final, and just like that, Maturana was heading back to death row. Dr. Dennis no longer has to choose between obeying the law and the ethics of his profession. The case is now out of his hands. While relieved, he worries that Maturana could now be put to death, even though, in his opinion, the man is simply not competent, with no idea of what it means to be executed.
He really doesn't have an understanding of what that means, believing he's already been killed before, he's been executed before, so he's already dead.
He says he's already dead?
Yes. He believes he's under special protection. He is scheduled to go now to the Vatican so he can be in exile there and get away from the situation.
And what outrages Carla Ryan is that even the out-of-state psychiatrist who found Maturana competent confirmed in his report that he believes he's dead. She read to us from that report.
They say I'm immortal. They shut my heart off all the time in here. I walk around sometimes for 2 days with my heart shut off. If I can survive that, maybe I can beat the lethal injection. I mean, killing him, he thinks he's dead. He thinks he's already survived it. He thinks they've been executing him for years. This is the doctor who says my client is competent.
So once again, Ryan went back to court, this time to try and get Maturana's death sentence changed to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Again, she was turned down.
To just proceed to kill somebody who has no concept of what's happening, who doesn't understand, who isn't being punished by